This chapter is on fluids, the electrolytes, and acid-base balance. It's chapter 26. So the first thing you need to remember is that the body is mostly water. That percentage of water changes over time throughout development. So with infants, about 75% of their body mass is water, but as you grow into adulthood, it reduces to about 50 to 60%. And then the elderly, it even decreases a little bit more to about 45%. And so this diagram is just showing, the brain, a lot of the mass of the brain is water, the lungs, the liver. So it's showing kind of the breakdown of these different critical organs and what percentage of them are water. When we talk about the fluid in the body, it's divided into different compartments, if you will. And the first major division is between what we call the ICF versus the ECF. The intracellular fluid, that's what's inside the cell, and about 60% of the fluid is inside the cell. So how much are we actually talking about? Well, in an adult male, you're talking about roughly on average 25 liters, so that's a fair amount. Now the ECF is extracellular fluid, so that's the fluid outside the cell, fluid that's surrounding the cell. So that accounts for about 33%. Now, of that extracellular fluid, it's divided into plasma, which is going to be about 20% of this extracellular fluid. A lot of it is interstitial fluid. So the plasma, remember, is the fluid in the blood. So the interstitial fluid, yes, it's part of the extracellular fluid. It's that fluid surrounding the cells, but not in the blood. And then there's other fluid that we have. Remember, you have the CSF, the cerebral spinal fluid, that's surrounding the brain and the spinal cord. You have lymph, you have synovial fluid in some of your joints. You have the pleural fluid that's in the pleural cavities around the lungs, the pericardial fluid in that pericardial cavity that surrounds the heart. You've got the peritoneal fluid, you've got aqueous humor in your eye. So initially you might think, oh, there's not that much fluid, and you stop and think about, oh, yes, there is. And this diagram is just showing your pie chart of the breakdown of it. So you can see, once again, about 60% of it is intracellular fluid. The extracellular fluid here, the majority of it is the interstitial. As we said, about 20% of this can be plasma, and this is that other, like the synovial fluid, etc. And this just so you are aware that these different fluids and these different compartments, they're not identical from one location to another. So when you look at what is dissolved, what the solutes are, a solute is something that is dissolved in a solvent. So in the human body, the solvent is water. But the solutes, the things that are dissolved in it, whether it's protein, whether it's electrolytes, etc., it differs depending on where you are at. So with this diagram, the tan color is your intracellular fluid, and then the extracellular fluid is that combination of the interstitial fluid and plasma, the blue and the red. So these two combined are the extracellular fluids. But you can see in this case, the extracellular fluid is very high concentration of sodium, but the intracellular fluid, so inside the cell, is very low. Kind of a similar thing with chlorine. Look at potassium though. Okay, it's potassium. That concentration is so much higher in the intracellular fluid than the extracellular fluid. Same thing with some of your phosphates, some of your proteins, magnesium. And so this, like I said, is just to show you that the composition of the fluid, what's dissolved in it, is very different depending on the location of it. So if we're talking about solutes and fluids and electrolyte levels and this water that is in the body, how do we regulate the water intake and the water outtake? Dehydration occurs when you have too much water leaving the body, not enough water coming in. And so how does the body deal with this? Well, you might think, okay, so how's the water leaving the body to get dehydrated in the first place. You have some water that leaves the body whenever you exhale. The air is moist. It has that water, that moisture, that humidity in it. Whenever you sweat, that's water leaving your body. And of course, urine. Where did this water from the sweat, when you're exhaling the urine, where did it come from? Well, it was originally in the plasma. It was part of that makeup. So if you're not taking in enough water and you have this water that's leaving by sweat, by urine, etc., and you start to get dehydrated, what's happening is that fluid, that water is leaving the plasma, and that's going to make the blood become more concentrated. When blood reaches a certain point, when it becomes more concentrated, it will reach a certain point that it will trigger your thirst response, to trigger you to, okay, I'm getting thirsty, I need to drink water. Another thing during dehydration that's going to be triggered is the release of the antidiuretic hormone, ADH. That stimulates the kidneys to reabsorb more water. It wants to keep you from getting dehydrated. You're already dehydrated. You don't want the situation to get worse. You don't want to lose even more water in your urine. And so that's why the ADH says, no, don't put any more water in the urine. You need to reabsorb it back into the blood to help dilute the plasma so it's not as concentrated anymore. Your urine will become much more concentrated because there's less water in it, which means the coloration of it, remember, is going to get darker. Another thing the body's going to do is decrease production of saliva. What is saliva? It's mostly water. Decrease it. That's why when you're dehydrated, you get a dry mouth. Something else that's not mentioned on here is decrease in production of tears. And that is one thing, some of you who are parents are very much aware of this. With an infant who is sick, one of your clues that the infant is dehydrated is if the infant is crying and there are no tears. Once again, the body's not going to say, oh yes, let the tears flow because we're already dehydrated, so let's even, lose more water. No, it's going to hold it back. When you're dehydrated, there's a drop in the blood pressure, and the heart's going to have to compensate for that. Typically, the heart rate gets faster. Aldosterone is going to increase sodium absorption in the kidneys. And remember, when you basically move sodium from one location to another, water is going to follow it. So if you increase sodium reabsorption, that means you're also going to increase water absorption. So for all of these, when there's not enough water in the body, you're dehydrated. That decreases that blood volume, like I said, and then that's going to decrease blood pressure. You need to react to this. It's going to cause an increase of angiotensin II. That in turn stimulates the thirst center of the hypothalamus. At the same time, because there's decreased blood volume, you've lost water, that increases the blood osmolarity, the concentration of the electrolytes in it. That's going to trigger, we're low on water. But once again, like I said, saliva production stops, so you end up with a dry mouth. This is also going to trigger osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, and all of these together, once again, are stimulating the thirst center in the hypothalamus, increasing your thirst. So take a drink, and then that's going to decrease the blood osmolarity to shut this off. By drinking water, you're getting more water in you, some that's going to end up in the blood, so you're going to increase the blood volume now. Solve the problem. Be very careful under severe dehydration, especially if there's been a lot of sweating. It's not just water volume that you have lost, you've also lost some of the electrolytes. And so in that case, you need to be careful not to, when the individual's thirsty, to give them just water. That's when some of your sports drinks that have electrolytes in them become very, very important to replenish the lost electrolytes as well as the water. So how do you regulate water output? Well, that's going to be up to the urinary system to basically deal with a lot of water loss from the body. When you have excessive production of urine, that's known as diuresis. The minimum level of urine production is about 0.47 liters per day. So that deals with the water, but you also have to deal with the electrolyte balance, what's dissolved in that water. And electrolytes, those are ions, they're charged, usually elements or charged particles that are in the water. Various electrolytes are found in the plasma, but also throughout the body. They have various functions. But regardless of where they are, whether they're in the interstitial fluid, whether they're in the plasma, they have a very specific function where the location they're at. And they need to be held, once again, homeostasis, here it is again. They need to be held at very specific concentrations, not too high, not too low. And so that's going to be very closely monitored. The 6 most important electrolytes, there are several of these, but the 6 most important electrolytes: sodium, potassium, chloride, calcium, bicarbonate, and phosphate. So what are the roles of the electrolytes? Why are they so important? Well, like I say, different ones have different jobs, if you will. Collectively, nerve excitability, triggering that nerve impulse, endocrine secretion, membrane permeability, helping to buffer some of the body fluids so they don't have too drastic of a change in the pH, the controlling of movement of fluids between the various compartments from intracellular to extracellular, and then respiration and renal functions will make adjustments to allow the body to regulate the concentrations of the ions in the extracellular fluid. And this brings us to the acid-base balance. The pH of the blood is very, very closely regulated. It must be maintained. They'll often say on average 7.4 is the pH. It can be in the range of 7.35 to 7.45. If you go too high or too low outside that range, you are going to get in some very serious trouble. A buffer is simply a compound that helps to prevent a drastic change in the pH when you have excess acid or excess base added. So it's helping to keep these drastic changes from occurring and maintain within that certain level of pH. Now, there's all kinds of different buffers in human body. There's 3 main buffering systems that involves proteins, but that's often in intracellular inside the cell. There's also phosphate, and one of the most important ones is the bicarbonate carbonic acid buffer combination. Your chemical buffers in the blood, they can respond in seconds to a change in the pH. Respiratory system can respond to changes in the pH, either increase your breathing, decrease your breathing, and the response time there, it's going to be just a couple minutes. So it's not seconds, but it'll be a few minutes. The renal system. Your kidneys can also respond because they also a big player for the acid-base balance, so they can respond to changes in the pH. However, their response time is going to be longer before you see the effect of it, and that can take anywhere from hours to days. So you look at the respiratory regulation of the acid-base balance. Basically, what respiration is going to be doing is regulating the level of the carbonic acid. How is carbonic acid formed? It's formed because carbon dioxide, which is a product of respiration, the cellular level, it's a waste product. It's in the blood to be transported back to the lungs so you can exhale it. Most of the carbon dioxide in the blood is transported in the form of the bicarbonate ion. What it does is the CO2, the carbon dioxide, is going to react with water, and it forms carbonic acid, which then dissociates into a hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. And because that hydrogen ion is released, that is going to affect your pH. So adjustments in breathing will change the levels of your CO2, which in turn is going to either increase or decrease the pH. High levels of CO2 is going to trigger an increase in bicarbonate ion, which is going to decrease the pH. Low levels of CO2 means low levels of the carbonic acid, which translates to low levels of bicarbonate, which then means you're going to increase the pH. So, with the respiratory system in terms of pH, with that acid-base balance. So here, if you're supposed to be, a normal homeostatic range, if pH drops, that's called acidosis. So it's dropped below 7.35. That drop in the pH is going to stimulate the brain as well as arterial receptors to basically increase the respiration rate. Why? Because you need to get rid of the CO2. Because remember, high CO2, low pH. So you need to get rid of the CO2. If you increase the respiration rate, that means that that's going to lower the CO2 rate, which means you're going to lower the bicarbonate rate, which means then that's going to increase the bicarbonate. This will dissociate into bicarbonate ion. This is carbonic acid right now. It's an acid. That's why the pH is low. So if you remove it, and how do you remove it? Because you break off a CO2 here. If you take out that carbon, you take out 2 oxygens, you're left with H2O, which is water. Take it off. Take out that CO2. And then that's going to end up increasing your pH, getting you back to where you're supposed to be. And then the reverse is true. If the pH is going too high, it goes above 7.45, that is alkalosis. Here, you're also going to stimulate receptors in the brain, the arterial receptors. What are they going to do? Decrease the respiration rate. Why? Because you want to increase the amount of CO2 in the blood, because that's going to increase the concentration of carbonic acid, which in turn is going to drop or lower the pH, restoring it, because it was too high right here. You need to lower it. So that's what the respiratory regulation system will do in terms of helping to regulate the acid-base balance. The response for this, as you can see, is, and timing-wise, is in minutes in terms of adjusting that respiration rate. Now, the renal regulation, that's said it's going to be, response time is going to be longer, hours, or, possibly a day or so versus minutes. In this case, what happens with the kidneys is they're regulating the levels of bicarbonate in the blood. So how much bicarbonate is actually in the blood? Sodium, it's basically a couple-step process. Sodium can be reabsorbed from the filtrate. Remember, in the kidneys, you're producing that filtrate. So filtration occurred from the blood. Sodium was pulled out of the blood. Put the sodium back in the blood. When you put sodium, when it's reabsorbed from that filtrate, the production of urine that you're making, when you put that sodium back into the blood, hydrogen ions are going to move the opposite way. So hydrogen ions are going to move into the filtrate. Cells produce bicarbonate ions. And there's a diagram in just a moment, I'll show you this, but the bicarbonate ions are going to move into the capillaries, the peritibial capillaries. When carbon dioxide is available, the reaction moves to form carbonic acid, which then dissociates into hydrogen and bicarbonate ions. So in this diagram, what you can see, it's often referred to as the conservation of bicarbonate, adjusting the concentration that's here in the blood. And so, excuse me, right here is where you have the carbonic acid. And so the first step here is showing that you are going, this is the filtrate over here. So this is where you're forming the urine. The sodium gets reabsorbed So it's going to eventually go this way. But this is where it's kind of like a turnstile, if you want to think. As sodium goes this way, look what happens to this hydrogen. It goes over here. And it is going to combine with bicarbonate ion that's in the urine, forming now forming the carbonic acid, which is now going to be broken down into water and CO2. Where does the CO2 go? It goes across here by diffusion into the cell where there is water. And what's it going to do once it's over here? Well, it's just going to combine with the water, forming carbonic acid. And what happens with this carbonic acid? It's going to dissociate into a hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ion. And the bicarbonate ion is going to be able to flow into, this is your capillary here. So it's going to flow into the capillary. Where did the hydrogen come from before? Right here. So you have this little cycle going like this. And that way you're able to distribute and put the bicarbonate ion into the bloodstream. And just so you know, a couple of the terms that are associated with the acid-base balance, a lot of people I know kind of struggle with this. Just remember, you're trying to maintain the pH. So if the pH drops, you need to bring it back up. If the pH goes too high, you need to bring it back down. When we talk about metabolic acidosis or metabolic alkalosis, metabolic is going to refer to the kidneys, the renal regulation of that. A little slower before you see the results, but it's still efficient. Respiratory acidosis or respiratory alkalosis is going to be dealing with the lungs. And so remember, acidosis is low pH, alkalosis is high pH. So metabolic acidosis, you have low pH. And how are you going to deal with this, or what is the cause? It's going to be dealing with the kidneys. It's usually due to a deficiency of bicarbonate. Remember, bicarbonate is, the concentration of that is controlled by the urinary system, by the renal system. So when you see metabolic acidosis or metabolic alkalosis, think of, oh, there's either too much bicarbonate or not enough. So metabolic acidosis, bicarbonate deficiency; metabolic alkalosis, high pH, bicarbonate excess. With the respiratory acidosis or alkalosis, you're going to be looking at the concentration of CO2 and carbonic acid. And so for respiratory acidosis, once again, acidosis is low pH. And in this case, you have excess CO2 and carbonic acid. Too much acid, that's going to lower the pH, because remember, acids have a low pH. Respiratory alkalosis, you have a high pH, so that means you have a deficiency of carbonic acid and CO2. Take the words, break it down, think of what it means. But it's very important that you understand that, the pH is constantly being monitored in the blood. The electrolytes are being monitored, etc. And you constantly make adjustments. A lot of it is done in the kidneys in terms of electrolyte concentrations. Too low of sodium, well, let's get more sodium in the blood. So when you're filtering the blood in the kidneys, reabsorb as much of that sodium to put it back into the blood. If there's too much, well, then you can let it be excreted with the urine then. Don't reabsorb as much. Maintaining that proper pH is what the whole acid-base balance is about. You need to keep it very stable within that tight range. And how do you correct if that pH is going too high or too low? You can adjust it by respiratory, you can adjust it by renal, which would be metabolic.